Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event organized by The Logic on Connecting Canada, 5G spectrum policy, and closing the digital divide. I'm David Reevely. I'm an Ottawa correspondent. I'll be your host and moderator, and I will introduce our sponsor and star panel in a moment. But first of all, this is an event that is open to anyone who cared to sign up. We have some subscriber events, but this is not exclusive. So just to begin, for those of you who haven't encountered The Logic before, I'll tell you just a bit about us. We are a digital publication that covers the future of the Canadian economy. We have reporters from coast to coast, from Vancouver to Halifax, and we are interested in where this country is going and how we are going to get there, and who stands to win and who stands to lose. Very policy focused, but policy as it affects real people on the ground. And that is essentially what today's event is about. When I joined The Logic 7 or 8 months ago, it was after most of my career at the Ottawa Citizen, general interest newspaper, and the Canadian Press, general interest wire service. And my boss, Jordan Tim, our managing editor, said that one of the things that The Logic wanted me to pay attention to was telecom policy. And things like spectrum auctions. And I remember thinking at the time, that is sort of an area that although I've always covered politics and government and policy, I've always thought of telecom as kind of the part of the map where it says, here be dragons, because it is almost perfectly designed to be very difficult to write about in a general interest publication. If there's one thing you learn very early on as a reporter, it's that editors are allergic to what they call process stories. There's this thing is really important, and there's going to be a committee meeting, and they're going to talk about it, and there will be decisions made. And at some point in that sentence, the editor's eyes start to glaze over, and he or she's thinking about something else. And telecom policy has that, and it has this layer of engineering on top of it as well, talking about megahertz and gigahertz and slices of spectrum and so on. And the complexity makes it very difficult, I think, for the average person to understand, at least the way it's been covered in most places. So what today's event is about is demonstrating how the way we allocate spectrum in Canada affects real people, real lives, real companies doing real things on the ground. Because if you care about outcomes, and everybody does care about outcomes, then you care about the processes that get us there. And we're going to make those links today. Our event today is sponsored by Telus, which is one of the big players in spectrum in Canada. We have, as a country, auctioned a great big slab of the wireless spectrum that is supposed to be the foundation for the next generation of wireless internet service, the 3,500 megahertz slab. And the government is currently consulting on the next big slab of that spectrum that is supposed to be released to auction, the 3,800 megahertz slab. And that auction is due in about a year. And the hope is that some of the deficiencies of the last auction, where companies like Telus and Bell and Rogers and many other smaller ones paid a collective $8.9 billion for their pieces of spectrum, that some of those deficiencies will be rectified, that where there are gaps in the first wave, they'll be fixed in the second wave. Telus is a sponsor of this event and is clearly a stakeholder in the outcomes of this whole process. But I should say that they've had no input into what we're going to talk about, the questions I'm going to ask, or anything like that. They haven't asked, and neither have we. So the discussion is free. But to kind of set the stage, we are going to hear from Jacob Glick, who's a vice president for public policy at Telus Canada.
Thanks, David. And thank you to The Logic for hosting this event. I'm joining the event today from Ottawa, the traditional home and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Understanding this history is particularly important on days like today, with the news coming out of British Columbia, and our Telus team stands in solidarity with the survivors of the St. Joseph's Mission Residential School and the family whose children attended, and in solidarity with the survivors of and intergenerational survivors of all residential schools in Canada and elsewhere. As individuals, leaders, and corporations, we must continue to educate ourselves, acknowledge our biases, and actively support reconciliation. David, I've been a paid subscriber to The Logic since day one. And so your reporting on the innovation economy, the intersection between innovators, investors, and policymakers is exactly the kind of original journalism needs. And so I'm very pleased to be able to support this event. So, spectrum policy, stay awake, don't hang up. You rightly put it that we think of spectrum policy typically as the purview of technical experts, but in reality, it is an area of public policy that affects everyone every day. And so I hope that today's conversation, we bridge what is a highly technical discipline, and we bridge that to the real life outcomes that impacts. And I also hope that it will be an optimistic conversation about how to apply public policy in a way that improves the outcomes for all Canadians and bridges our digital divides. Spectrum policy in particular can and does determine the quality of wireless internet access for all Canadians. And so that has particularly critical outcomes in the context of rural connectivity, Indigenous reconciliation, and the digital divide broadly. Taking a step back, Canadian telecom policy is meant to accomplish two things. It is meant to protect competition and encourage the building of world-class networks and connectivity for all Canadians. And over the past decade and a half, as the federal government has allocated spectrum in service of these objectives, it has created an unfortunate unintended consequence of deepening the rural-urban digital divide. Because over that time period, spectrum has been sold, often at a discount, a 10 to 1, 5 to 1 discount over what other companies pay. It has sold spectrum to companies who squat on that spectrum rather than using it. And this unintended consequence has had a material and negative impact on communities and Canadians. So when there is that consequence of spectrum squatting, it means that underserved communities don't have access to education, don't have access to medical care, don't have access to the opportunities of the digital era. And this inequality is made even more stark in the context of the pandemic, where access to broadband underpinned those services even more than it ever has. So let me give you a very specific example of how this plays out in today's 4G networks, forgetting about the 5G networks that David spoke about a second ago. Telus today provides a 25 megabit wireless high-speed internet service in BC and Alberta. So that means, people get a modem, they put it in their house. That modem, creates a Wi-Fi network in their house, just as if you had a cable going into your house, except for this modem connects to the wireless networks. And this is available in places where it is either impossible or impractical to build wired line networks. Although Telus, just as an aside, has built our pure fiber network deep into rural areas of BC and Alberta. In fact, we started building our pure fiber network in rural communities, not in downtown Edmonton or Vancouver. So we provide this 25 megabit service in BC and Alberta today. 25 megabits is half of the 50 megabits service that could be provided, or that ought to be provided in the context of what the CRTC defines as true broadband service. And we could technically, on today's networks, provide a 50 megabit service if we had enough spectrum to support that service. But today we don't. So in the places where we provide that service, serving hundreds of thousands of Canadians in rural Alberta and BC, there's another carrier who has spectrum in the exact same geography that we have it, in places that we've built networks, in places that we provide service, but because they are squatting on that spectrum and not using it, today those Canadians are underserved by broadband in a place where there's no technical limitation on them getting a true broadband 50 megabit service. But that carrier is letting that spectrum lay fallow and sit on their balance sheet in the hopes of selling it, presumably, and flipping it for a profit. This form of spectrum squatting harms rural and indigenous communities, and it has to stop. And there are ways to fix this problem as we go forward into the next set of spectrum auctions, auctioning key 5G spectrum that the government is consulting on right now. The government, with the spectrum that it's prospectively going to auction, can cap the amount of spectrum that carriers can get to ensure that every single carrier can have, in the 5G context, 100 megahertz, which is just an allocation of an amount of spectrum, 100 megahertz of spectrum to deploy the 5G service that it needs. That's what the international technical standards say you need for a true 5G experience. And with that 100 megahertz, companies like Telus, when we build out our 5G networks in these rural and remote areas, we will be able to support 100, even 200 megabit service to rural and remote communities. So think about how that will enable access to education, access to medical services, access to opportunity in places today that don't have a true broadband service. So we can actually use technology to bridge the digital divide if we get the policies at our auction correct. Similarly, we need to require that carriers who get spectrum at auction are required to build networks with that spectrum. Use it or lose it. So it can't be acceptable anymore for carriers to just sit on spectrum. They have to deploy it. So with these two policies, we can actually have the kinds of outcomes that we're looking to achieve in our telecommunications policy to the benefit of all Canadians. We can have competition, we can protect it, and we can have true broadband for all Canadians so that none of our communities are left behind. So that, I think, is actually a very optimistic optimistic view, I hope, David, to turn the conversation back to you and the panelists. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks very much for setting the scene that way. I'll introduce the panel in just one sec. But before I do, we have a chat function open. If you have questions that you want me and the panel to address, please use it. The conversation will be best if we talk about the things that you, the interested audience, want us to talk about. So without further ado, our all-star panel, which spans, I think, 8 time zones, as an example of the sort of amazing thing you can do if everyone involved has pretty good broadband access, begins with Kalvin Bahia, who is the principal economist at GSMA Intelligence, which is a global group that works with and represents wireless providers, mobile data, both providers and the companies that supply the technology that they use. He is in Britain. Next is Helaina Gaspard, who is the Director for Governance and Institutions at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. That's the institute where the former parliamentary budget officer, Kevin Page, went when he realized his term was up, but he wasn't done glaring beadily at what the federal government was spending money on. She focuses on state institutions that incentivize and govern the behavior of actors, essentially what institutions do to get us the outcomes that we want and whether it works. And in BC, we have joining us Denise Williams, who is CEO of the First Nations Technology Council, which works with Indigenous peoples, governments, academics, and technology futurists to map an ecosystem to result in fair and equitable access to the tools and education required to lead digital transformation into the 21st century. And aside from that, and many other things, aside from her day job, she's from the Cowichan tribes of Vancouver Island. So to begin, I'm going to put my first question to Kalvin Bahia. Can you give us some concrete examples of ways that 5G will change our lives? Some things that people hold in their hands aside from faster cell phones? What difference is it going to make?
Hi, David. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me on this panel. I've been really looking forward to it all week. Your question is a good one. Being an economist, probably we don't have the best reputation for forecasts, so I probably shouldn't commit myself too much to this. But I think it is worth flagging that when you're talking about what will 5G do, it's worth thinking about the fact that this is mobile technologies. They evolve very quickly, and you generally see these technologies evolve in 10-year time spans or less. So at the beginning, in 2001, when I was just starting university, I had a Nokia 3310 where, I was mostly just using it for calls, trying to write short texts and playing Snake. 10 years later, I think I just got my first iPhone, but wasn't doing much more than browsing the internet. And now 10 years later, I have a phone where, the majority of what I do is around applications, streaming, watching video. Obviously, in the last couple of years, been using it to help work from home and also use it for online schooling with children here. So I think it would have been very difficult to foresee how those things would have happened 10 years before. So I think if we're looking at what's going to happen to 5G 10 years from now, I suspect that a lot of the different things we might do are currently unknown, especially how they might be used by enterprises. But if I were to think of a couple of concrete examples, as you say, I think there is the faster broadband, faster internet. With most countries now where they offer 5G, they tend to offer unlimited data. So it's the idea of just sort of trying to use Wi-Fi in your phone or trying to limit the amount you're doing to avoid going over your data cap. I think that will change things because people can use as much as they want and the speeds are much faster as well. So I think you will also see a shift to other devices, so phones being one, but I already know people who are using their AR and VR headsets using 5G, so that could be something that changes. And I think the other one, it was actually mentioned by Jacob, but I think is very important, that a really important potential use case for 5G is around what we've been calling fixed wireless access, but it's as Jacob described, it's having a modem where instead of using it for Wi-Fi, it connects directly to your wireless network. And with the speeds and the capacities available on 5G, in those areas, especially in rural areas where it's very difficult to, or there's not much of an economic case to expand fiber to the home or cable to the home, 5G fixed wireless access solutions, I think, and we've done a lot of research showing that they can be very cost effective to deliver the very fast broadband services that are needed to close the digital divide. So I think that's probably a short summary from me.
Thanks for that. Denise Williams, and then I'll put the same question to you, Helaina Gaspard. In the communities that you work with most, what are some of the ways that the way Canada has allocated spectrum so far has failed? What have we got wrong?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I'm calling in from Tsleil-Waututh territory, where we're relatively close to Vancouver. We're in what's now called North Vancouver. So, we do have a level of access here, but that's not the case for over 75% of the communities that I serve at the First Nations Technology Council. So there are literally thousands of First Nations peoples across this province that don't have access to the 5010 standard that has currently been what we've been striving toward. And what that has meant through, obviously, the pandemic is Indigenous peoples don't have the same level of access to education, to healthcare, to economic development opportunities. But I think what's really important around how we have approached this question has been that we've thought about it as an economic opportunity primarily, and I think that this country hasn't fully recognized that access to spectrum is it's an Indigenous right to have access to this resource, and it's not. I don't think it's appropriate to be thinking about it as something that we need to be, fighting over. And I was just talking about this multi-billion-dollar, these multi-billion-dollar bids that are happening. When I think that I think we have a bigger question on our hands about how we want to approach truth and reconciliation in this country, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to think about how access to spectrum, internet connectivity, affordability actually underpins all of the articles of UNDRIP, and all of the ways in which we're going to implement the action plans in that work are all reliant on affordable, reliable access. And so I think it's really critical that we start thinking about it that way, and we start respecting Indigenous people's rights in this country to have that level of access. And that's a lot of the work we're doing here in British Columbia. Is we are organizing for the first time an Indigenous digital equity strategy, where we so far have 33 First Nations service organizations coming together to determine what the future of digital equity in this province is going to look like, and hopefully across Canada, so that we can invite into those spaces, government and industry, so we can have these conversations about what policies are possible to put in place and to shift, so that we can advance truth and reconciliation in Canada, we can advance digital equity, and that we can begin to lay the groundwork and the infrastructure to ensure that future generations aren't experiencing what the kids today here in British Columbia are, which is a lack of access and a failure, frankly, of a market-driven model that we think is going to result in digital equity. It so far hasn't, and I'm not convinced that it will into the future. So I think it's really important that we start to be more bold, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. I'm glad these conversations are happening. I agree. I think a lot of folks do tend to shy away from wanting to talk about spectrum. It is complex, and I'm glad that today we're at least elevating this conversation here today.
So to drill into that a little bit, the way it's been generally done so far is the industry department, the innovation, science, economic development department auctions these slices of spectrum through various means, but fundamentally they go to the highest bidders. How would you, in as specific terms as you're able to go, how would you want to rework that to be more equitable and just?
Well, I think first of all, the consultation needs to be reworked. I don't think Indigenous peoples have been adequately consulted over the years, and I think that even speaking to numerous leaders with the Assembly of First Nations and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs here and the First Nations Leadership Council here, we haven't been engaged in the consultation or even understanding what the opportunities are for our engagement for our people. So I think it's really important that level of engagement start happening, and again, that our Indigenous rights are recognized, and that we're not treated as stakeholders, but as rights holders in this country. So I think that's a good starting place. And I think that Indigenous peoples, should have a level of access to spectrum. And I think that it's been done. There's precedents for this around the world, in New Zealand, in the US. Indigenous peoples are owning spectrum and are able to build and design and determine what their digital future is going to look like for their peoples. And I think it's important to move away from thinking of Indigenous peoples as consumers and customers when their ROI gets interesting, or when there's a level of government subsidization available to connect our communities, and more toward spectrum, an idea of spectrum sovereignty and ownership that sees our people having access and the ability to, like I say, build out this resource for future generations' use. I think one of the big missing pieces currently is the recognition and the respect of our rights to access, away from being just mere consumers.
Helaina Gaspard, to the question from a minute ago, what are some of the ways that we have not allocated spectrum very well? And what are some of the consequences of that?
Certainly. So thank you for the question, and it's a pleasure to join you on the panel this afternoon. So one of the considerations that our work has certainly highlighted when we think about spectrum policy as one step in an overarching process when we're trying to foster connectivity really across the country into communities who have such different contexts and such different points of departure, very much as Denise was highlighting, whether those are First Nations or Indigenous communities or whether those are rural communities. And it's important to remember too that just about 20% of Canada's overall population is residing in a rural place. And so when we consider the current state of the auctions, we know, as you had pointed out, David, they actually generate quite a bit of money. So that last auction generated just about $9 billion. And when we think about the cost of connectivity and we think about the cost of connecting Canadians no matter where they live, which has been such an important declared priority for this particular government, it's important to consider those ranges, that $9 billion that was leveraged through the auction to raise through the last auction is roughly in line with the cost of connecting Canadians everywhere with multimodal connectivity, right? So leveraging that critical wireless broadband piece, and leveraging other technologies and tools to be able to foster that. And so keeping in mind that different communities will have different ways of approaching this becomes essential if we're going to talk about connectivity for all. Those instruments will differ, the incentives will differ, and part of the opportunity here, especially as we're looking ahead to the forthcoming auction, is to start to draw those linkages right from the outset. Talking about spectrum policy is absolutely critical. But just as important is trying to understand the goals or the ultimate goals of that connectivity. And how we get there really matters. And there are a lot of jurisdictions that have interesting models and examples and approaches and tools that can be leveraged. And I think part of the opportunity here is recognizing that different places will need to connect differently, and they'll require also different approaches and different types of subsidies or incentives to be able to do that. And certainly in our work on instruments associated to connectivity, that element or that question of public subsidy ends up playing quite heavily in those discussions. And so when we look at that fiscal case, invariably there has to be a mix, especially when we're talking about much less dense rural areas where that business case does not always exist in the same way as it does in densely populated urban places. And so starting to understand right from the outset the differences in those communities, the differences in their needs, and certainly too, clarifying what that ultimate objective is will help us put those pieces of the puzzle together right from the outset of the spectrum policy all the way through to connectivity.
So without getting too deep into the weeds on the past auction, there was the slices of spectrum were divided up both on the spectrum and geographically, so that there were different auctions, essentially a whole bunch of different auctions for Toronto versus Northern Ontario versus Labrador versus Red Deer. What is the evidence that that is not a great way to achieve the outcomes that you want?
So I think one of the important points of departure here is to actually think about our current connectivity rates. As Denise had highlighted, certainly too, as Kalvin had highlighted, there is variance in connectivity rates across the country. So when we're talking about First Nations communities, roughly 35% are connected. When we're talking about rural places, just about 46% are connected. And when we're talking about urban places, our connectivity is virtually, perfect, getting very, very close to 100%. So in some ways, when we think about connectivity as part of our marker, assuming that connectivity is our goal, the more people that are connected, the more people that are able to connect reliably, no matter where they are, should be one of the core indicators of how we're doing. And I think you ask such an important question, David, when you ask, how do we know if we're doing well? How do we know if these policies are successful? And this is actually a really big question for IFSD generally, but also too when we think about spectrum policy. What are you measuring, right? What are the variables that actually help us understand whether this policy is working well, is meeting the declared intent, is an efficient use of public money? So those are critical questions that need to be asked, and certainly something that we're going to continue to dig into from our perspective here.
Talking about knowing exactly what your goals are. Kalvin Bahia, with your global perspective on different ways that different jurisdictions allocate spectrum, the stated goals for the next round, printed off the ISED website this morning, say that we want to encourage competition in the wireless services market, improve rural connectivity, and ensure the effective, which presumably means quick, deployment of 5G technologies. And it's not stated, but achieving maximum benefit for the people of Canada, however we understand that term, for the resource that's being auctioned off. All those things together. Can one approach do all those things? And if not, what are some of the trade-offs?
No, excuse me. That's a very good question. I think some of those aligned. I think the last one you mentioned is perhaps one where there's a trade-off, and one which we've seen certainly in a number of other countries, a trade-off that perhaps hasn't been considered. So when we've looked at a lot of the studies we've done on effective spectrum policy, there's a number of different aspects of spectrum policy, but three that I think are worth highlighting. One is, I guess, quite obvious, which is that the earlier release of spectrum, the better. If users can't use it, then they can't deploy the networks that are needed. So delaying that obviously results in delays in deployment. The amount of spectrum is key. So more spectrum means you can deploy in more areas and with faster rates. If you don't deploy this, if you have less spectrum to deal with, then that typically means you have to deploy more networks, for example, deploying more sites. So that will add to the cost. And then the third element is around the cost of spectrum. Now, particularly when you're talking in Canada and a number of other countries in auctions, that the cost of spectrum sometimes, and when I sort of first got into this field, I often found it confusing, because in an auction, the operator decides how much they pay. If I was going to bid in an auction for something on eBay, I set the price by deciding how much I want to pay. It's not like someone necessarily sets it for me. But there are two factors. One, so in a lot of auctions, there's a minimum price that you have to set, so that can influence it. But also going back to the amount of spectrum that's available, if you restrict the amount of spectrum that's potentially available, you effectively have an excess demand where you've got more operators trying to require a smaller amount of spectrum, and that artificially pushes the price up. And I believe that was a key consideration in the Canadian auction last year. And what our research shown is that if you have less spectrum, or if the price is paid is above what you would expect in a market-driven auction, then that does have impacts in terms of reducing investment in networks. And most importantly, and I completely agree with Denise and Helen on what they say here, what we care about here is the outcomes, which you have to decide what you want. So, and if your outcomes include digital inclusion, widespread coverage and connectivity, and also faster networks. So, it's not just about whether you're connected anymore. It matters whether you're on a 5 megabit connection or a 100 megabit connection. All those things are impacted by the spectrum policy. So we do see a lot of governments internationally. One of their key objectives is maximizing auction revenues. It's a perfectly valid objective. Governments often have fiscal constraints. It's a fairly easy target to get a windfall from an auction and then spend it on key government priorities. That's fine, but to answer your question, yes, there is a trade-off that if you do that, then you may be compromised on some of the other targets you're setting. So that's I think a lot of countries are now being aware of that. And just to highlight some examples in Europe, which we're seeing, which are trying to do similar things as Canada in terms of closing particularly the rural digital divide. Here in the United Kingdom, in a couple of years ago, the government and the mobile industry agreed something called a shared rural network. So in areas which didn't have 4G coverage, which after 10 years weren't being reached, industry and government agreed an amount of funding that was needed to deploy networks in those areas. It's a shared network, so all the operators can share it, so that you don't duplicate networks. and also it was jointly funded. So industry contributed 50% and the government contributed funding, which was actually, their funding came from spectrum fees. So you're reusing those spectrum fees to do that. Just to add a couple of other examples, in recent years in France and Portugal, when spectrum has been renewed, rather than renewing the spectrum licenses for significant fees, they agreed with the operators to discount those fees, but in return, the operators had to deploy their networks in rural areas where it wasn't available. So we're starting to see some of those, I think, some of those trade-offs aware of, and governments that really do want to prioritize the digital inclusion part are shifting their focus.
David, can I jump in there? I just want to
Please.
pick up on the really important point I think that Kalvin's raising when we're talking about the role of spectrum itself as a public asset, right? And then having these goals associated to connecting harder to reach places like rural communities, like First Nations communities in Canada, and really having to accept and understand the trade-offs that come along with that, right? It's easy to say we want to generate revenues from auctions, which is great and certainly understandable. But certainly from what we're seeing now in Canada, there's anywhere between a half-half share to a 2/3 public, 1/3 private sort of split in the way projects associated to connectivity are being funded in harder to reach places. And that's certainly an important factor to keep in mind when we're thinking about how you actually incentivize the deployment, how you incentivize connectivity, and recognizing that there is going to have to be some matching going on, and certainly leveraging, as in the case of the UK, private sector interests and certainly their capacities and their technologies to help bridge a lot of these gaps. There are a number of really helpful examples in different jurisdictions across Canada that have sought to do this in a number of different ways. A community like Olds, Alberta, actually established their own not-for-profit and started delivering internet services to their own community because they thought it was the most effective way of actually leveraging their resources and also to promoting that connectivity. We see, similar efforts in Ontario with the Swift Rural Broadband Network, where a group of rural municipalities came together and started to share resources, took, federal dollars, took provincial dollars, and actually run what's effectively solutions-based procurement to help close a number of those gaps. So lots of interesting solutions, but a critical reminder that these things won't get done by themselves. That business case when it comes to service and paying for services just doesn't exist in the same way in a lot of those harder to reach places as it does in comparison to urban centers.
So, Denise Williams, what does that look like in the First Nations context, particularly, especially if we do find a way to handle the distribution and allocation differently along the lines that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, well, I think what it could look like is similar kinds of solutions. I think that nations here are thinking about owning and building those kinds of networks as well, and trying to understand, currently where do we need to invest to build that kind of infrastructure, whether that's in a community or whether that's regionally amongst a number of different communities. I know, especially along the coast, the coastal First Nations are having really interesting conversations about how to enable things like the Guardian Watchman programs and stewardship, land and marine stewardship programs, by connecting and building different kinds of softwares that are aligned with the kind of data governance that is in line with the values and the protocols and the traditions of the coastal First Nations peoples. So I think that those kinds of collaborative efforts regionally are happening. And then, British Columbia as a whole, what we're trying to understand at the First Nations Technology Council and as well at different leadership tables is how can we start to build those opportunities for nations and groups of nations to come together to think about what are the next steps to build out those networks, build out those opportunities, but ensure that the values of Indigenous peoples are at the heart of that design and that effort. So I think it could look similar. Again, I mean, it's not that there's a technology issue. I think all of this is solvable technologically. It's empowering and giving voice and space to Indigenous people to determine what they want that future to look like. So I think absolutely in British Columbia there could be opportunities, very similar to that.
Helaina, to take up a question from the audience, what are some of the spectrum implications for the Rogers and Shaw merger, assuming it goes ahead, and particularly for what we're talking about here, serving more rural and remote communities? What difference will it make if there are fewer big players?
So I think one of the important things to keep in mind about the overall environment of spectrum policy and certainly the importance of spectrum for connectivity here in Canada is really to focus on those modalities, right? What happens after the fact once that spectrum is allocated? And in some ways, those questions for us, those middle piece, those instrument questions that are so heavily focused on implementation may not be as, say, interesting or as newsworthy, but actually end up being those pieces of the puzzle that really drive how people use or can use internet, or rather connectivity, moving forward. And so in our work, what we found is the critical importance of data and actually understanding, the areas that you are looking to cover or that you're hoping to cover with your deployments, and ensuring that data is bottom up and is actually tied, to the terrain, tied to the geographic, tied to the population realities and the density considerations in that area, becomes absolutely critical. And so what we've certainly seen in our work is when you can add or include those deployment conditions and those requirements for use, sometimes you can help to generate far more likely outcomes when it comes to connectivity. One interesting model that we looked at was the Federal Communications Commission in the US. And so specifically when it comes to promoting rural connectivity, the FCC runs a reverse auction to help to subsidize unconnected or rural areas with very low levels of connectivity. And part of the reason that to us this instrument ends up being quite interesting is because it's heavily focused on capturing and understanding what those individual places, what those individual communities need and what they look like. And so in order to determine what level of public subsidy is required to help promote that connectivity, the FCC actually goes out and asks the market, right? And the FCC has, working with their economists, with all of their engineers and experts, they have a set range of a price, if you'll call it that, to help promote connectivity in these areas. And then they go to auction and they ask firms, they ask the private sector to tell them what they think would be a reasonable price to cover a particular geographic area. And critically there, and sometimes it works. When it works well, there are always deployment conditions, especially for, say, the first 40% that are applied to those arrangements. And that means that the vendor is obligated to ensure deployment right at the outset. Part of the challenge there is what happens later on, right? What happens after that, 40% coverage or connectivity rate has been achieved? Where do we go from there? So I think, David, from our perspective, that question of what happens in between, how we leverage instruments and leverage instruments differently, becomes quite important to fostering that connectivity.
We're in our last few minutes, so I'm going to put the same question to each of you in turn, and that is, what are international models that we should be following? What countries do well in the areas that that we should be caring about, whether it's connecting rural communities, whether it is treating First Nations properly, whether it is getting 5G out into the world quickly. Is there one model, or are there chunks that we should be taking from here and there? I'll put the question to Kalvin first, and then Helaina, and then Denise to finish up. Kalvin, who should we be ripping off?
That's a heck of a question. I think, again, it's perhaps the easier answer, but it's been really interesting for me listening to Denise and Helaina, because I know certain aspects of the Canadian market, but not as in detail as others. And what it has shown me is that, I guess it's obvious to say every market is unique. So I think there are certain best practices that we know from evidence, what I mentioned before, acknowledging the trade-offs between different, well, I'll go back first step. First of all, making clear what your objectives are. Spectrum is ultimately a means to an end. It needs to be used to provide a service. It can be used to provide a number of things. So we need to be very clear what it is the objective is. And then the next question is how best to achieve that. So we know that, there are good practice examples. If the objective is to have connectivity in a large number of areas in that's affordable, that people can use it, early and more spectrum is beneficial at a price that is in line with what the market would expect, rather than artificially inflating prices, is positive. But then when you sort of get to beyond the specifics, I suspect there's different things we can pick up in different areas. Helaina mentioned a very good example there of the US reverse auctions, which I know have got a lot of interest and attention internationally. I believe some countries such as Turkey have actually implemented them as well. But I mean, I guess it goes without saying that the situation in Canada, it's, the geography, the topology, the social and cultural considerations, they're incredibly different to, what we have here in the UK, what you have in other European countries as well. So I think we need to be mindful of those, and you can probably pick certain principles or practices from other countries, but they will probably may need to be applied in specific in the specific Canadian context.
Absolutely.
Helaina, who do we copy?
Great. Yes, thank you. I think Kalvin said it well. I think it's not about copying wholesale, but I think it's about taking those best lessons from different jurisdictions. And it's so important to remember here that our geographies are so fundamentally different. We often look to the US because they have mountainous terrain, they have really cold winters, they know what it's like, to not be able to access, a wireless site because you're plowing through mounds of snow. And so part of the message I think that I'm certainly taking away from this panel is the importance of using different solutions to solve different problems. And I think the critical message is that we're actually looking to solve fundamentally different problems and fundamentally different public policy questions in urban places versus rural places when it comes to connectivity. So if we're going to take lessons from different countries internationally, of course, looking to countries that look like us is really helpful, but also too, looking at others who have succeeded on different fronts. What did Korea do to promote its incredible connectivity rates? How does Japan do it? We look at the UK and they have a great practice of engaging stakeholders, of reporting quite publicly on those consultations, and also too, of leveraging clients, of leveraging citizen needs to actually help to dictate or inform what some of their responses are. And then of course too, looking to places like the US, where we see some of those market-oriented solutions can be really helpful when we're trying to incentivize investment in harder-to-reach places.
Denise, are there good models to follow for respecting Indigenous rights to spectrum?
Yeah. Like I was saying previously, I think that there has been some great successes in other places. I was first inspired by this work when I heard Maori leaders come and talk about what they were able to achieve in New Zealand, and I mean that was. As I understand, a long negotiation and challenging to implement. But I think the fact that there's now a level of ownership of spectrum and telecommunications by the Maori people is incredibly inspiring, and it happened a number of years ago. And so I think what's happening in the U.S. In terms of set-asides for Indigenous peoples, and that consultation that has been happening with the FCC has been one that we've been watching as First Nations people in BC. I mean, it's been pointed out that there's geographic differences and there's differences in Indigenous communities as well, where there's larger tribal nations in the US. So when they're looking at how to allocate spectrum based on kind of that air parceling, over the nation, that looks really different here in British Columbia. We have 204 First Nations. Lots of them, are smaller certainly than the Native nations in the US, where you've got 10 to 30,000 members. We have communities here that are maybe 300 to 500 members. So, just to say that I think the approach and the way that those discussions are going is one that, perhaps ISED could think about here in the CRTC. This is kind of what we're looking at as First Nations leaders, trying to get into this conversation and trying to understand the ecosystem and what's possible. That's definitely, one to watch for us in the US. But like I say, there's, First Nations across Canada are remarkably different. So, a First Nations approach in Canada, what would work in British Columbia wouldn't work for all First Nations across Canada. So there's a level of complexity in trying to imagine what the approach or model would be that would serve all Indigenous peoples in Canada. Recognizing the geographic diversity of this country, but also the needs of each of these communities is incredibly unique.
So my key takeaways, as the ways in which I've gotten less dumb in the course of the last 45 minutes, I think, are recognizing that Indigenous peoples and First Nations have rights that are not necessarily respected through the traditional auction process that we're used to, and that something needs to be done about that. That rural areas generally cannot be served effectively by the same processes that serve urban areas. I got that from you, Helaina, and the idea of reverse auctions as a mechanism for dealing with that. And Kalvin, the idea that extracting billions of dollars from the providers, although it serves one public purpose, does not necessarily help serve all the others. Is there key stuff I've left out? Anything that you want to make sure is in the audience's brains and my brain before we wrap up? Any of you? All of you?
Sounds like a good summary to me.
It has been a real joy to have all of you on and to speak with you previously. Kalvin Bahia is principal economist at GSMA Intelligence in the UK, working on issues of spectrum and wireless service around the world. Helaina Gaspard is director for governance and institutions at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. And Denise Williams is the CEO of the First Nations Technology Council, and she's based in BC. Thank you all for being part of this. Thank you also to Telus for their sponsorship of it, and to Jacob Glick for his remarks at the beginning. And thank you to all of you who have been watching and listening for the last 45, 50 minutes. The logic is overwhelmingly subscriber supported. We have a hard paywall that you might have run into. We ask you to pay for our journalism, but our value proposition gets better by the day. Our subscribers are our lifeblood, and we are growing, and that's thanks to you. So we hope you will, if you aren't a subscriber yet, we hope you will sign up. And if you are, we hope you'll keep reading, and that all of you will join us for the next event at the next opportunity. Thank you all very much.